imperial government of China followed a policy of isolationism, a closed-door policy towards Western powers. And such a policy was dictated by two considerations. One, of course, was the concept of the central kingdom. You know that China believed that China stood at the center of the earth and all the countries standing on the periphery, on the boundaries. And China was a center of civilization, and all other people were barbarians. Men from afar, they are barbarian people. That is the central kingdom concept or the middle kingdom concept. That was the essence of Sinocentrism. So that was one thing. The other thing is that China also felt, there was a feeling in China, and it was a feudal China at that time, that China had nothing to gain but much to lose by coming into contact with the Western powers. However, it was not possible for the imperial government of China to continue such a policy for a long time because pressures had been mounting from the Western powers. And ultimately, China was forced to open at least one port city, and that was Canton, to the Western powers. And Canton would be the place where foreign powers would come and conduct their business operations. And it was the opening of this port city of Canton that started in a process that ultimately led to the Opium War of 1840-42 and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, which was the first of a series of humiliating treaties that ultimately brought about a transformation in the Chinese society. The beginning of China's regular and direct contact with the Western powers started at the beginning of the 16th century, when the merchant adventurers from different countries of Europe flocked to China in search of business, in search of profit. The process started in 1514 with Portugal. Portugal was the first. Portugal establishing contact with China. And all these merchants, Portuguese merchants and other merchants, they were all known as merchant adventurers. Portugal at that time in the 16th century, that was the greatest seagoing nation, sea power in that century. And Portugal was attacked. Portuguese merchants were attracted to China particularly because of silk products. And they were also attracted towards the east, towards the Eastern world for spices. Spices were needed in the European countries. And there was a great demand for all these commodities, not only in Portugal, but also in other countries of Europe. And Portuguese supremacy in the 16th century, it was curbed later by the Dutch and the British merchants in the 17th century. And so in the 17th century, we have the decline of Portugal and the rise of the Netherlands, rise of England. And also, apart from these two, the Spanish merchants and French merchants, they also started setting up their business centers in different parts of East Asia. Now, China quickly fell prey to foreign capitalist aggression and control. And there are, in fact, three stages of Western capitalist intrusion into China. The first stage commenced from the mid-18th century and continued till the Opium War of 1840-42. And this stage is known as the stage of mercantilism or the stage of merchant capitalism. That was the stage when we have the East India companies coming up, and they adopted a policy of plunder. Now, the second stage started from the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, and that continued till the end of the 19th century. This was the stage which is known as free trade, laissez-faire, or the stage of industrial capitalism. And the main feature of this stage was export of goods to colonies or countries like China, which was not a colony at that time. And the third stage commenced at the turn of the century, that is the 19th, 20th century. And when we have finance capitalism and we have capital investments in industries, in banking, etc. And a large number of countries were involved in the penetration of China. Britain, of course, was the foremost of all these powers. Then we have America, we have Germany, we have Italy, we have France, Belgium, and some minor countries. China remained, and whole China was divided into spheres of influence among the different powers. And ultimately, China became a colony of Japan only in the 1930s, when Japan invaded China and captured Manchuria. Now, so that was the third stage of Western penetration. Not just Western penetration, Japanese penetration was an Asian penetration. From the mid-18th century, China's commercial relations with the Western powers were established around the port city of Canton. Canton at that time was the only port city which was legally, officially opened by the Chinese government to the Western merchants. And a trade developed around this port city of Canton, which came to be known as the Canton trade. At that time, there were Chinese merchants who were known as the Hong merchants. Hong merchants operated under the direct control of the Crown, imperial government. And they had set up their own business firm, which was known as the Kohong. It was this Kohong, or the Hong merchants, who were in charge of business in the port city of Canton. And whenever a foreign power came, foreign merchants came, it was their duty to see to it that they get some area for their business, for conducting their business. The quantity of the commodities to be made available in the market, the price to be fixed for their sale, etc. All these were decided by the Kohong, by the Hong merchants and their firm. These Hong merchants, to start with, they were independent merchants because China was still an independent country, and they were under the control of the emperor, of the imperial government. And it was by virtue of this position that the Hong merchants amassed huge wealth. When the foreign traders came, there was a change in their character. Many of them started to become their agents of the foreign merchants. And it was by acting as their agents that they also accumulated wealth to a very large extent. And you know that there was much demand for Chinese goods, many goods of China. Chinese silk was one, porcelain was another, tea of course was another, brocades, that was another. So there was a demand for many Chinese goods in the Western market, and the American and British merchants, they bought those commodities in large quantities from their designated areas within the port city of Canton. In this way, they carried on their business activities. The merchants, one section of the Hong merchants, as also a group of new merchants cropped up, who came to be known as the comprador merchants. They were known as compradors because they acted as agents or brokers of the foreign firms, and they ceased to have any independent existence of their own. One Chinese scholar, Ian Ping Hao, described these compradors as a bridge between the East and the West. In fact, he has a book which bore the same caption. So that brings us to another aspect which was closely associated with the Canton system, Canton trade system, that is the tribute system. The coming of the Western powers meant that some relationships were going to be established between the two parties, two sides. And this relationship was based on the tribute system. And this tribute system was influenced to a very large extent by Chinese own outlook towards other countries of the world and also towards history. And according to that concept, it was a Chinese concept, and that was a central kingdom concept, that China stood at the center and all others are standing on the periphery, and they are all the men from afar. Foreigners, they were barbarians and of course uncivilized, and China was the center of civilization. That was the concept. Now, this concept of central kingdom was also fed by Confucian ideology. Confucius was one of the leading philosophers of China, one of the leading. There were many other philosophical schools in China also. Anyway, this tribute system was, in one sense, was the application of Confucian principles to foreign affairs. And by this, the Chinese got the moral authority to establish their political control not only throughout China, but also over neighboring countries, men who had been coming from afar. And it was a Chinese emperor which gained the mandate of heaven, and so he was the emperor. And it was the mandate of heaven which he received to rule over mankind, not only over China, but to rule over all the people in the earth. It was his duty, emperor's duty, to be benevolent towards all men from afar. And since he stood at the top of the central kingdom, at the helm of the central kingdom, it was expected of the foreigners to express their loyalty, to owe their allegiance to the Chinese emperor. So we have a reciprocal relationship. The foreign merchants coming and they were offering tribute. That was called the tribute. They were offering something which was regarded as tribute in however whatever form, and the emperor in turn, out of benevolence, he offered gifts to the foreign merchants. That was what the tribute system was all about, and it was accompanied by ritual performance of course also, and that was known as a kowtow system. Kowtow means a series of kneelings before the emperor with the head upon the floor. That was a system which is known as a kowtow system. And there is no doubt, it is quite easy to know who was superior and who was inferior. The secret of the tribute system was that it had become the necessary vehicle for trade. So without tribute, the foreign merchants were unable to carry on their trade inside China, inside the port city of Canton. And when they paid tribute to the emperor, they were enrolled as tributary countries, tributary nations, or tributary merchants. And so certain ports and markets were designated for them, as we have said earlier. When the first Europeans reached Canton, they were similarly enrolled and they became part of the Chinese tributary system by paying tribute. The peak period of the old Canton trade was from 1760 to 1840. That is the beginning of the Opium War, 1840. And it was carried on under a working compromise between the Chinese tributary system and the European mercantilism. That was the basis of the relationship between the two. We have the tribute system, we have European merchant capitalism or mercantilism. But a time came when Western powers they were keen on making further inroads into China. And it was pressure from their side, that started to disrupt the Canton system. And at the beginning of the 19th century, foreign capitalists, they forced into Chinese markets to a very large extent, despite restrictions imposed on them by the Canton system. There was an increase in the demand for those Chinese goods for which there was a demand in the Western market. We have the silk, we have porcelain, we have tea, we have the brocade. And until about 1820, Western purchases were made in Spanish silver dollars, known as the Carolus. And it has been estimated that by 1810, a total of $350 million had been introduced into China from the beginning. Total $350 million. And what is quite evident is that as a result of this, there was an inflow of precious metals into China, inflow of a huge quantity of silver into China. So the balance of trade became favorable for China and unfavorable for the Western countries. Now, despite all this, expansion of British trade outside Canton was not allowed. Smuggling took place. Unofficially, transactions were carried out, but officially, trade outside Canton was not allowed, and the Chinese government officially followed a closed-door policy and totally isolationist policy. Now, according to Fairbank, the policy of partially closing the country arose mainly from the anxiety of the Chinese government to protect their existing political and social regime from foreign influence. And the dominant scholar officials or the scholar gentry, who were feudal in character, they distrusted the foreign merchants because they distrusted all merchants. And of course, there was also the belief among large sections of the Chinese people that China had nothing to gain but much to lose by coming into contact with the Western powers. Not only Western powers, meaning Western traders and missionaries also, both of them. And so closed door policy in one sense was a defensive reaction from the Chinese side. And one important point is that the closed door policy was not applied to Russia. Russia was considered to be a neighboring country, not a European country. There was no thinking that they were barbarian and other things. In spite of Chinese opposition, the Western powers, of course, put increasing pressure on China during 1820, 1835. And when the Napoleonic Wars were over at the beginning of the 19th century, Western countries became more aggressive than ever before. And that was the period when we have the advent of the free trade or the laissez-faire. And this free trade concept from the Western side was incompatible with the Chinese concept of treating the Western powers as barbarians.
So, what is compradors?
Comprador actually is a Portuguese term which literally means purchaser. In a Chinese context, compradors were those merchants who acted as agents or brokers of foreign merchants. They received commissions from the foreign traders, and they had their interests totally tied up with the interests of the foreign merchants. And in this sense, they became part of the process of colonial exploitation or foreign capitalist exploitation of China. They were very much, and the same was the situation in our country also. We have leading business houses initially who received 1% brokerage commission from the British merchants. So that was comprador.
Sir, why did China follow the closed door policy?
Closed door policy, as I have partly pointed out, that one, of course, was the reason that that was the concept of the Central Kingdoms, the Sino-centric idea, Sinocentrism. China stood at the center of the earth. So there was nothing to learn from the other countries. That was the concept. It's a age-old concept. But that was one. But the most important reason possibly was the fact that since China was a feudal country, China believed that the Western countries were countries which had a different social system. And of course they had. The merchants were coming from the capitalist countries or going to be capitalists, such countries. And capitalism was something which they correctly regarded to be detrimental to the interests of feudalism. That was one. That was important economic reason. And the other reason which we can cite is that there was no demand for Western goods in the Chinese market. Why at all should China establish contact with the Western powers when she had nothing to get, she had nothing to gain, and there was a fair chance to lose a lot by coming into contact with the Western powers. Pressures had been multiplying on the Chinese government to open up newer and newer areas because China was a vast country and there was much demand for Chinese commodities in the Western market. It was very lucrative, no doubt about it. But the balance of trade was unfavorable for the Western powers because the Western powers, they were going on paying and paying all the time by getting Chinese commodities. Of course, they sold those Chinese commodities in their own countries, but they had been going on paying and paying for goods with silver. And so there was a need from their side to make the balance favorable, to turn everything upside down so that the balance becomes favorable for them and unfavorable for the Chinese government. And it was in such a context that they introduced opium as a commodity to make inroads into China. Now, when one thinks of opium, we always get a picture of large numbers of Chinese addicts who throng the gambling houses and addiction centers. You go through children's magazines, you go through Tintin's books, you will have the idea of Chinese who are always addicts. Now, that was a false impression that was given by the Western powers in order to legitimize their inroads into China. And they believed that they were on a civilizing mission to civilize people of all other countries. Now, the reality is that for the addiction of the Chinese people to opium, the main responsibility lies with the British and Americans. Opium was not unknown in China. Poppy cultivation was there. But opium was used only as an ingredient in the preparation of medicine. It was not for people's consumption, as was pictured, as was projected by the Western powers. The British and American merchants started exporting opium to the Chinese market. There were two sources from which opium were exported to China. One, of course, was India, and here we have the British merchants along with Indian compradors, Indian businessmen. And the other was American merchants who exported opium from Turkey, from Persia. But probably the quantity of British opium was greater than the quantity of opium which was exported by American merchants from the Asia Minor region. Now, initially, the Manchu government, imperial government, they permitted imported opium to some extent because they thought that it would be used as an ingredient in the preparation of medicine. In 1773, the British government adopted the policy of large-scale opium exports to China. And the smuggling of opium to China fetched enormous profits for the British merchants. And according to one estimate, the cost of one chest of top-grade opium in India in the year 1813 was 237 rupees, but its price after auction rose 10 times, totaling 2,428. One chest of opium in the year 1813. Before the importation of opium into China, the company had to spend huge sums of money every year in silver to purchase Chinese goods from the Chinese market. So there was an outflow of silver from the West. But now when opium was introduced, there was an outflow of silver from China, an inflow of silver back to China again. And for the opium dealers, the trade was immensely lucrative. William Jardine, one of the biggest of the British opium smugglers, he disclosed in a private letter that in the good years, gross profits were sometimes as high as 1,000 shillings a chest. Some of these opium smugglers, these nefarious dealers, they could manage to become members of the British Parliament, while some were knighted. They received knighthoods for their achievements. And there was another opium dealer, opium smuggler, James Mathieson, apart from Jardine, who amassed huge fortunes. It was so much that it was possible for him to buy an island off the west coast of Scotland, and he could spend £329,000 on its reclamation alone. And the money mainly came from the opium business. So you can understand that how lucrative the opium trade was. And he was also knighted by Queen Victoria. And these two smugglers, they worked hand in glove and formed the Jardine, Mathieson and Company, which exercised complete monopoly over exports from India to China. And here we have a large number of Indian compradors, the Parsi merchants, Marwari merchants, Gujarati merchants, and other business communities playing a leading role as underlings to the British in this opium traffic.